Hey, Scott from MyGrowthRings.com here, and here once again is my home shop, and welcome to our midweek episode of Stumped Q&A. Our midweek video is a follow-up and kind of a circling back to the weekend video where we answer your questions, comments, and cheap shots. We. Who's this we? Me and this mouse in my pocket. This last weekend, we finally got around to applying let's call it a wash coat to this what once rusty old jointer. I'm not sure if I mentioned this. Back in the 1980s, when I was the manager of a Shopsmith store in the Boston area, I got frustrated that the jointer and the planer that we had in our showroom and also in our classroom, our academy, were always getting tarnished and fingerprints and rust. And it came to a head one Friday morning when I arrived to find that somebody, after our Thursday night sawdust session, had left a styrofoam coffee cup on the 12-inch planer bed, creating a nice deep ring of rust. Well, for those who know me, I kind of fall into these, I don't even know how to describe them, but I'll go nuts, and suddenly I have to go out and buy calculators for every room in the house because I couldn't find a calculator. Well, anyway, I went on this mission to get all the cast iron in the place down to bare metal, and to make sure it would never look like that again, I took oil-based polyurethane and cut it in half with mineral spirits and put a wash coat on. My theory was it would penetrate in enough into the pores of the cast iron and keep it from rusting. After that cured, we then applied our paste wax to it, and we just maintained it as normal, and it never rusted again. They all looked beautiful, and people would ask, how were we able to maintain it? And I kind of didn't want to share it because I wasn't sure it would be Shopsmith approved. All these years later, I still do that with my cast iron surfaces, and so that's where I set out with this old rusty jointer to get it to that condition when, after mentioning using poly, several people mentioned maybe I should use a water-based poly. So we've done a test, water-based, oil-based, water-based, oil-based. We did it this way because the infeed and the outfeed tables of the jointer are going to wear differently. The finish, I'm assuming, will wear differently. A last-minute entry was the recommendation that we ought to try Penetrol. And this is a product that's typically added to paint. There's an oil-based version and a latex-based version of that, and it helps it bond to metal better, and it helps it fight rust. And I had never really heard about it being used on bare metal, but several people commented on it. I researched it. Sure enough, it sounds like a legit thing. So I applied that to the fence. What I'll tell you now, with this having cured for several days, it is very slick and smooth. 2 days later, it was kind of sticky, but now it seems to be ready to go. Everything is cured. I still have this oil-filled heater down below that's keeping everything warm. Right down here, it's keeping me a little bit warm as well. So let's get these questions answered, and then we're going to get this lubed up. Now, I'm going to use 2 products for that as well. We'll talk about that when we get to it. So yeah, one of the questions was that I had missed something about the application of the polyurethane. That was, I missed mentioning mixing it 50-50 with paint thinner. I put that on the screen, but I didn't say it, so now I've said it. Greg said that my suspicions about the Penetrol were correct. He looked up the MSDS sheet online. I should have done that, and my eyesight is now bad enough I can't read the label. But it smelled like linseed oil, and sure enough, it is flammable, and spontaneous combustion is possible. So you want to be careful with your rags when you put that on. So thank you, Greg, for confirming that. Lance said, he asked if I had ever built Nick Engler's jointer extension fence and outfeed table. Well, first off, the fence that he had was the Shopsmith aftermarket accessory fence. That's something you can buy today. I used to use that a little bit in the academies in the late 90s. I use an extension fence I made myself. It's straightforward, it's simple. Well, I'll show you that, not in this video, but I don't see a need to buy the one that Shopsmith sells. Theirs will accommodate some feather boards to hold down. I do not like using feather boards holding down on the jointer. So we'll talk about that at some other point. The Outfeed extension I've never made, and I'm curious about that. And one of the big things I'm curious about is, I don't know when Shopsmith added this little lip on the Outfeed bed of the jointer. It's not on my original jointer that's back at my other shop. And Nick's Outfeed extension rests on that. So if I were to make something for this, I would probably key it in a little bit differently so that it would be universal. So I'm not doing that tonight, but that's an interesting idea. So Lance, thank you for bringing that up. Bill says that he has used Penetrol when he sandblasts things down to bare metal, and that's a great protectant against rust. Sorry, the questions are out of order here. And Mark said, looking forward to seeing the jointer, and that he's never really been able to convince himself that he needs one. I tell you what, years ago, and maybe they still do it, Shopsmith would have a promotion every year where if you would buy the Mark V, you would get one accessory for free. And most people pick the bandsaw because really it's the sexiest tool. And while I can't argue against that, what I will say is if your plan is to do furniture making or cabinet making, meaning that you're going to be preparing a lot of square stock, the jointer is critical. The jointer makes the table saw perform the way you thought that it should. And so while it's not a terribly exciting tool, it's a pretty important tool. And I use it just about every time I use my table saw. So there's my vote. So what I want to do now, because underneath this tape is that bare cast iron, if I could have done this, I would have put the poly on and then peeled that tape off immediately, because normally I want to get a nice clean line, but I didn't want to have that bare metal exposed. So we're going to take this off. The poly is just a thin layer on here. Remember, I applied it and then I wiped it off. And so it's almost not even there. And then, so I immediately need to get some something on here to protect the surface. So what am I going to use? I'm going to use Johnson's paste wax on the outfeed table, but on the infeed table, I'm going to use this product, CRC 336 or 336. This was one of Fine Woodworking's top choices for a spray-on lubricant for power tools. I've not used this. I have used Bow Shield quite a bit, which, as I mentioned, I don't have that here. It's over in my shop, and somebody forgot to go pick that up. I'm not going to point any fingers here. Used a lot of paste wax over the years, Butcher's, Brie wax, but the Johnson paste wax, not only does it work really well, but it's inexpensive and it's available pretty much everywhere. So that's my go-to. And if you didn't catch it in the How to Wax Your Shopsmith Mark V, what I do is I put a clump of wax inside the rag and then apply the wax through the rag. So I'm not applying a big glob of wax directly onto the cast iron. So it's just melting through the rag and is going to give us just a thin film. So before we reinstall the fence, I need to put the feather guard back on, and then there's a quick lesson to learn about the fence before we move on, but let me get this done. So right now I have the guard wound with the spring wound tight, but I have it on this side of the little stop, and as soon as the fence is installed, I'll lift it up and over and it'll be ready to go. So as far as the fence is concerned, one of the frustrations that I know that people have with this is when they get the fence off, it can be difficult to get on. And that is because this mechanism that actually locks it onto the front rail has a little pin that floats. And when we tighten this up, see if you can see that, it pushes that pin forward. And what'll happen is with the fence completely off of the jointer, people will pick this thing up and not notice that that pin has drifted forward, and now they won't be able, they can't slide it all onto the jointer. So you want to be sure that that pin is dropped in place, out of the way, and then we'll slide that onto the rail. I mentioned this before, but I think it bears repeating here. The fence adjustments are pretty straightforward, yet they're not necessarily intuitive. In fact, quite often on the Shopsmith forum and also on the Shopsmith owners group, people will comment saying they've got their jointer fence locked down, they've got it set to 90, and yet it's still floating all over the place. What are they doing wrong? Well, remember that this is a 2-position wrench. When it's pushed forward, you're able to loosen and tilt the fence to whatever angle you desire. And when you pull it backwards, you're able to tighten that little floating pin I mentioned earlier. And that way you can get this at whatever position you need. In fact, you might find that it's tight here, but now the handle's in the way. We'll just push it in and it'll drop out of the way. We do have some stops built in here that'll bring us to 45 degrees to 90 degrees, but those stops are only accurate if you've taken the time to set them. I do set them, but I also don't trust them. So if it's critical that I have a 90-degree angle here, I'll always check it with a square. With all jointers, there is a minimum length piece that you can safely joint. With the Shopsmith jointer, it's about 9 inches. And back when I was an academy instructor, came to the realization that these 2 bumps right here and right here happen to be roughly 9 inches center to center. I remember asking our engineers why those were there, and nobody seemed to know. They think maybe it was used at some point to set this up in some tooling for surfacing. But what I've always done is taken these and highlighted them with a red marker. And in that way, it's just a quick reminder. I don't have to measure my pieces. I just have to take the stock that I'm thinking about jointing and hold it up to the fence, and I immediately know whether this is a length that is safe enough to joint. This would not be. This would be okay. The jointer runs on the lower spindle of the headstock. The lower spindle is running 1.6 times the RPMs of the upper spindle, so that runs the jointer at the correct speed. I could have this running along with the table saw because the table saw speed is the correct setting for the jointer. So I take my stock that I'm going to joint. This is hideous. There is no right way on that one. And I'm going to lay this against the fence. Sorry, I haven't been able to smoke my pipe out here because of the fumes. I'm going to take that, hold it against the fence, put a little bit of pressure against the feather guard, slide the feather guard back to the stop. That's that little pin that was bolted through the table. And then we're going to tighten that up. So now that will allow that thickness of stock to go through. What's happening here is the infeed table or bed sits lower than the outfeed bed, which is itself flush with the cutter head. I can lower this table, and there's a gauge here on the side that I can set. Normally I have this set to take off 1/16 of an inch per pass. So as I start my stock through, I'm holding it down on the infeed table. It's going to pass over the cutter head, taking off 1/16 of an inch, and then now it'll be level with the outfeed table. At that point, once I have about a hand's width of stock over the outfeed table, my downward pressure is primarily over on the outfeed side. So really I'm pulling it through the jointer as much as I am pushing it through. So let me take off some jewelry. I take these off not because I think that I'm going to get my watch caught in the jointer, but I don't need the distraction of having something come loose. And that doesn't come off, so we're just gonna leave that there. And let's get... So here you can see the gauge. You'll also notice that mine is filled with sawdust. I don't ever clean that out. I notice that if I do clean that out, dust comes flying out of that crack. So I just let it fill up with dust, and dust doesn't fly out of that crack. By turning this knob here, I can raise or lower the in-feed table, but you'll notice once I get to the 1/8 inch point, it stops because this stop gets in the way. So if you're gonna remove more than 1/8 of an inch, you gotta flip that stop up, and then you can continue down. Now we do that when we are rabbiting. We're taking off typically a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch in a pass, and we continue to take only that amount off as we rabbit. You'll notice as we go back up, that stop will drop back in place, so we don't even have to remember to set it. Going here. And that's all there is to it. Can you eyeball down that? Oh, we're not square. I forgot to check it with the square. No, we are square. That's funny, the camera's making it look out of square. Crazy. Anyway, that's all there is to it. Nice, clean, jointed edge. I think I've mentioned before that I just leave my jointer right here installed on the end of the Mark V. This is the end that lifts up to the drill press position, and on the Mark V, I do not ever have to remove this. Those of you who bought the Mark VII, you do have to remove your jointer. I also never use my extension table on this end. That's because there is a little bit of play between the way tubes and this bench end, because that's where it locks and unlocks, and it's possible to get a little bit of misalignment. Well, if I have my fence on a table down here and it becomes slightly misaligned with the saw blade, that's not a good prize. So I only ever use my extension table with a fence on the far end, the jointer's right here, and I can do anything and everything you can do. In fact, I can do it better. Anyway, we'll come back around to the jointer again at some point when I have more to share. We'll put an extension on the fence and who knows, maybe even extension on the bed. But thanks for watching and make it a great day.